My job as an architect is to take a situation and to translate it into a three-dimensional thing we call a building, which can be not only used, but will also, in its design, represent that situation in relationship to the tradition of that situation.
I can't imagine not being an architect. When I get up in the morning, I think about architecture. Just before I close my eyes, I think about architecture. I became really interested in architecture way back in my early teen years. A lot of things were happening in New York. I was raised in New York, in Brooklyn, and I like to go down to places like Wall Street and wander around on a Saturday morning when there was nobody else there and look at those buildings, which have become my friends, shall we say.
The idea of architecture as the making of a nicer world was very much connected to getting out of the lower middle class world of Brooklyn that he felt was so limiting to him. Bob always felt as if he were born to be in the Knickerbocker Club, even though his background was not the same as many of the other people who were members of that club. I think he was always interested in the world.
I was going to be a modern architect. I mean, who were the heroes of those days? Nice, Le Corbusier, Gropius. And then I set out to go to architecture school at Yale, and it had a wall of glass on the north side, and you could sit at your desk and look out across the Yale campus to see the stone buildings and the brick buildings, mostly by James Gamble Rogers. I realized that despite what the teacher said, that you can't do buildings like that anymore, but I still thought I was going to be a modern architect.
When Bob was at Yale, Paul Rudolph was the dean, and Paul Rudolph did not love Bob's work, and he gave him a hard time about his work. And so I think the idea that years and years later that Bob could come back and be the dean for a longer period of time than Paul Rudolph was incredibly important to Bob. And it's he got to settle a score.
I met Bob at a modern architecture symposium in the summer of '62. This kid who's a graduate student running all these highfalutin professors in 3 symposia. That was incredible. I thought Bob was going to run the world.
And in 1963, Bob first became involved in the Architectural League, and he was just coming out of Yale. At the time that he started working for the League, the organization had very little connection to his generation of architects, but he really made a difference. The biggest one from his time as the Mills Fellow was an exhibition he did called 40 Under 40, which it was a show of 40 young architects who he thought should be getting more attention. So everybody, I assume, wanted to be in that show, and it caused a big splash.
When Bob did 40 Under 40, it was a wonderful thing to kind of stimulate interest and get a lot of people into the spotlight. It helped establish the whole idea of a community of architects making a community of architecture. I mean, that's a really, really important thing.
And then around 1970, I was put on the board of the Architecture League by Rick Franzen, who was then president. And Rick put me on the nominating committee around 1972 to select the new president. And he looked at me and said, "Suzanne, I was wondering if you have anybody you're thinking of." And I said, "Well, what about Bob Stein?" And then he said, "Oh, that's an excellent idea." And that was a done deal. So then Bob was put on as the youngest president of the league at that time. He was about 31 or 32, and the league had been in severe financial difficulty. And so as a young kid, Bob was able to get the league out on even keel. Also, he was able to put on exhibitions that people paid attention to and start program discussions and panel discussions, and people were gathering.
He convinced a lot of people to care about architecture, regular citizens, not just people who were architects or planners or connected to architecture. If Bob was in the room, he made everybody there care about architecture.
And he went on to work for Richard Meyer for about a minute, and then he was working for Sam Ratajkowski at the Housing and Development Administration, and then he started his own firm in 1969 with John Hagman.
And immediately started to meet important people, which helped him get set up with clients. When Bob was very charming, amusing fellow.
Bob was a man about town, and he was connected with the museums and the artistic world and finance, and he was, a magnetic personality.
The yellow socks, the Gucci loafers, always with a martini. He was the life of the party, and he thrived on that. He got energy.
Every conversation with Bob was a wonderful mix of architectural insight, talk about new buildings, nice, friendly questions about what you were doing, and gossip. And the gossip always kind of excited him. But I think it was driven really by just a love of information and love of talking about things and people.
And then in the 70s, they broke up that practice, and then Bob started Robert Ames Stern Architects. The firm was growing through the 70s and into the 80s. Several of the lead partners now joined the firm in the 80s.
When I started here, it was a much smaller office. By default, each of us, and there were 3, 4, maybe 5 of us at the most for the first year or so that I was here, we were given projects to run with hardly any experience. And the means by which we were trained was essentially we were thrown into the swimming pool to see if we could swim. And most of the time we learned how to swim. And that experience, that hands-on experience, I think was so valuable. And it's, as large as we are now, it's something that I try to continue with the people working with me on projects these days.
His superpower was bringing together such a group of talented people. I mean, we have a really loyal, long-time staff here who've worked very closely together, very closely with him for years and years. And that is really special and unique.
I believe that a really important part of Bob's legacy is the office and the way in which he founded and structured and thought about the office through his entire career. And he was very clear he did not think about it purely as a commercial enterprise, which many architects do. I remember he was quite adamant about saying, we're not the architecture industry, we're a profession.
Bob likes to talk about how the whole office functioned like being in school, really. I mean, we really worked like a seminar class studying history. We worked like a studio class working through options together, coming back year after year, building relationships.
Bob was always very interested in doing work that grew out of the place. He was very interested in the character and the DNA and the architectural history of the place, what made the place unique, what made it different from other places, and how could we pick up the thread and carry that forward and extend it and improve it and contribute in a way that extended and enhanced the character, but really brought forward what was there already.
Bob always say, when you walk around, don't look at your phone, look up. There's so many presents that, you could get inspired from just walking up the street.
He never had any ideological connection to a particular style. He didn't do, the way a lot of architects in the 19th century did Gothic buildings because they really believed this was sort of God's architecture, and you were obligated to do this. But there was no God's architecture for Bob. He just liked a lot of different things. And he wanted to treat history like this great smorgasbord that you could just, pick and choose the things you liked from. He was interested in a wide range of styles and in weaving them together where possible.
He demanded excellence in the process that could lead up to a good building, in research, in how presentations were put together, making sure drawings were straight, getting the models right. And then, of course, in the design of the building, he demanded excellence. This was very important to him.
He could be very direct on his comments because he cares. And all that comments really helped me to grow as a better architect.
But he was also really fun. He would sing us show tunes. He would come up with ideas for parties and celebrations.
You can remember every single thing he ever said to you, everything, whether it was positive or negative or even neutral. Every conversation I've ever had with him, I think I can remember.
And he didn't always know what the answer was to what would make a great building on a particular project. He didn't always know, but he did know when it wasn't good enough.
He wanted people to stand up for what they believed in and defend a position, and he wanted to see multiple options. And we would start a project with many options, and we would ultimately end up with none of those. But whatever we ended up with would be inspired by what we learned.
He didn't, beat around the bush. And if he thought you were being lazy, he could be quite searing. And so, but he was also incredibly helpful and perceptive, and really, looked at our work and didn't judge it based on ideas he brought, but based it on trying to understand what we were trying to accomplish. He created a firm that gave proper credit to his partners and elevated them and gave them public exposure based on their talent to allow the firm to carry forward. I mean, there's so many architects of his generation who simply either didn't care or actually did not want their name to continue on a firm they weren't in control of. So I think that's remarkable.
The second chapter in Bob's career, which was all of the work that we did for the Walt Disney Company. When Michael Eisner made Bob a member of the board, in a way, it was Bob's going to business school. He learned how a big, well-run company works, and it was very influential on him.
If there's ever any place in which the idea of place means everything, it's Disneyland. And Bob was always fascinated by the way in which reality and fantasy work together to make place. And he knew that, there's a little touch of the stage set to all architecture, really, or almost all architecture.
Eisner really liked Bob's directness and the way Bob told it like it is. And that Bob knew enough about architecture, but he always treated his clients very, very well. He treated them as if they were geniuses and as if he loved them. He didn't treat anybody else that way as much. I once said to him, treat me like a client, please.
And Bob put together with Jack Robinson the entire idea of how to build Celebration, which I think is one of the best land planning communities in America. He also did 14 buildings for the Walt Disney Company, more than anybody in the, almost 100 years of the company. So he was really the reason, or one of the reasons, that we got a lot of credit for bringing Disney back to life.
The third major chapter was when Bob went to Yale. And when he became the dean at Yale, it was hugely important. It was one of his great goals was to become the dean of Yale Architecture School.
To Bob, in some ways, was like coming home, because he had come to graduate school there. It is the pinnacle of academia, of architectural academia. It's something he could never turn down. And it was a great opportunity for him to go beyond teaching, which is something he clearly loved to do.
The president of Yale at the time was looking for the next dean of the School of Architecture. Many names had been considered and rejected. Bob was called to give advice and ended up becoming the choice of the president. And there was a lot of, I think, upsetness in the architectural community, like, wait, Bob Stern, traditionalist, classicist, postmodernist. Ooh, ick, nobody wants that in a dean. He's going to make the school look like a million mini-me Bob Sterns. But what happened was, and this is truly to Bob's credit, was the exact opposite. He didn't want a million mini-me Bob Sterns. He wanted everybody else in the world who had a different opinion. So from Frank Gehry to Zaha Hadid to Leon Krier to, classicists, neoclassicists, postmodernists, deconstructivists, not just designers who had really different points of view, but historians and theorists who had different points of view. I mean, he engaged this idea of pluralism, and he wanted all the viable viewpoints represented by the best voices he could get to come to Yale.
I don't think he wanted everyone to do architecture just like him, because he thought it would be a boring world. They did. I mean, he was bound and determined to create traditional buildings, but he also loved to talk and to argue and to have intellectual discourse and so forth. And if everyone was doing the same thing, there's not enough to talk about. But he also, I think, really intellectually believed that there are a lot of different ways to do good things, and that it was quality that mattered, and that the job of the school is to teach students how to be good architects, not how to be one particular type of architect.
He hired me. I taught at Yale for 25 years, and we never agreed about anything. But that was the kind of person that Bob was. He would set up everything so there could be a discussion. Bob was my dean. So I have an enormous debt to Bob because I loved teaching at Yale, and it was a really exciting place.
He was the greatest predecessor dean a dean could possibly have.
So when Bob went to Yale, we knew that he was going to be gone a lot. In fact, Yale required him to be at the university 3 days a week. And so suddenly the partners were running the office, and sort of senior leadership took on a much stronger role in the office than they had before. Bob trusted us, and we were able to represent to our clients that Bob could not be at every meeting, that we were leading the office.
When I became dean at Yale, for the first few years I was dean, Bob continued to teach. He taught a couple of different seminars about postmodernism, and boy, was he exacting. He was absolutely exacting. But at the end of every semester that he taught, the students always, to a one, commented how much they loved him and how hard he made them work.
Everybody stayed up late preparing for the final review. I was so tired and exhausted, and I was just laid back on my chair, and just Bob walks by me, and he was just tapping on my shoulder and smile. All my stress just went away, and was still very rewarded on what I did, and some kind of proud. He really pushed me in that role to be a better architect who really cares about architecture.
I also think that's true in his books, his New York series. It's unbelievable. That's just an extraordinary undertaking, what he accomplished there.
If you'd done nothing but that in your life, you'd be remembered. And that was only one small part of Bob's life. I mean, of course, he did also have a whole team. He didn't write every word and research every word of all those books himself, but he did conceive it, orchestrate it, and was deeply involved in every aspect of it from beginning to end. So he was definitely the conductor of that orchestra, so to speak.
Bob wasn't just the conductor of the New York series and all the writing that went in the book. He was first violinist. He was an active writer and an active rewriter of the entire process, the background and the stories behind the architects, behind the real estate machinations for each project. On the other hand, he also gave great freedom to his writers, and it was an interesting process of collaboration.
He was willing to spend time in the basement of Avery Library, flipping through the real estate record and builder's guide to understand how developers and investors and real estate brokers and architects working together saw the city. That he understood that the city is not only the biggest, most known monuments, but the making of the fabric of New York City was very important too.
Total history of the architecture of New York for a period of about 140 years. And it's also a history of cultural and social attitudes. It's full of quotations from contemporary critics about each and every project practically. New York is like the Mississippi River. It's just this vast thing that just keeps flowing. And these books are the record of everything that flows by.
It takes energy and ambition and persistence to do something so in itself monumental, to record all of that history, which is just such an immense gift to the city itself and to future historians and students of New York City that those books exist.
I mean, I don't know where he found the time. You hear that over and over about Bob, like where did he find the time to do this?
He wanted to show that he could do the Pevsner, the history of architecture. He's going like, I don't need a master's. I can show them I can be an architectural historian without having to have the credential. Yes, he could do it. He was successful in everything he decided to do.
I chaired the board of the National Building Museum and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And on each board, he was, for me, such a wise counsel, but also generous and articulate and engaged and spot on whenever there was a question about what to do or something that needed to have a sort of an expert opinion. Bob was the prevailing voice. He was just whip smart, and I mean his You know, he worked all over the world. He had some of the best architecture, some of the best clients. I respected it, and I was inspired by it.
More than anything, Bob was a teacher and a mentor, and he always looked at people with the lens of, how can I get them to do better? How can I get them to do their best? And he got us to do our best. There's an incredible group of people that he mentored and taught that I think today are carrying forward his legacy, and it broadens his reach even much more than what he had done himself.
It's on us, it's on the partners and other senior leadership in the firm to make sure that that lasts, but it's very much in our DNA.
When people's around, you don't really think about, how much influence that you got from that person. But like once that person is no longer present around you, you begin to realize that person really influenced me in many, many ways. I think that's what Bob was for me.
He was an important person for sure, but I think that the emotional response to his death and the number of students and the number of people who worked with him over the years was just so moving. He was certainly thinking about how he would be remembered, but I don't think he would have known that there was this really emotional, wonderful response from so many people, and that honor sort of kept rolling in and was very moving. If there is life after death and Bob's out there looking down, I hope he was aware of that, because it would have been a wonderful thing for him to see.
We got to see every facet of his personality, I think. So in the same way that you feel like, when a beloved family member dies, they live on a little bit in you. I think he lives on in thousands of people, his students, his employees, his friends.
Merely for the combination of all those different things, teaching, academic administration, writing, designing, public advocacy. Who else has done all of those things together so effectively?
He's a once-in-a-lifetime personality, and that has staying power.
Not because of what he built, or necessarily what he wrote, but what he was. And I don't know how to describe that any differently than that.
I'm always a student. If you're a teacher and not a student, you're not a teacher really. You're just a rhetorician or something like that. No, you have to be learning new things. That's what I love to do.